Welcome to Optimal Game State. This week we're going to take a look at the Bretonnian faction in Age of Sigmar Warcry. In the Age of Sigmar, one of the rare factions that have survived from the old world untouched is Bretonnians. That's because Bretonnia is blessed by the Lady of the Lake herself, their eternal patroness. They've preserved the noble traditions of their Bretonnian ancestors, resplendent in the glory of their chivalrous past. Though the realms have changed, these valiant knights remain steadfast in their devotion to the ideals of honour and righteousness. As they march across the mortal realms, with valiant retinues of courtly knights and fair maidens, they seek to defend the kingdom from the horrors lurking in every shadow. They valiantly charge into battle, banners fluttering proudly, riding on steeds and clashing swords with their enemies. With each victory, they reaffirm their faith in the righteousness of their cause, and the Lady of the Lake smiles upon them. This is a relatively small faction, with only 19 profiles in total, and of those, 7 are part of an Underworld's warband. At the very bottom of the range, at a cheap 55 points, we have the humble Men-at-Arms, a lightly armoured fighter who makes up the bulk of the Bretonnian warbands. Without any armour, these are relatively fast and, more importantly, cheap. There are 2 other standard fighters that we'll get into later, squires, either on foot or mounted. As this is supposed to represent a questing warband, there aren't any ranged fighters, like you'd expect in the wargame, as that would be unsporting. After that, everything is a hero, and broadly speaking, this is split into 3 groups. The royals, so the king and the archking, the knights on foot, and the mounted knights. Those knights are split again into whether they are descended from noble lineage or not, with the noble knights referred to as courtiers. These courtiers cost more, but are tougher and do more damage. Broadly, you're looking at light foot troopers, heavy foot troopers, or mounted troops. Then, with the heroes, you have the same decision but with more elite options. All fighters in this warband have access to the following 3 abilities. Skillful Parry is a reaction you can take whenever you're targeted by a melee action, but before the dice are rolled. As with all reactions, you are losing an action, which is a big deal. Unless of course you're in narrative play, where you can use those points renown to trigger the reaction instead of using an action. A defensive action like this is actually decent. If you think you're going to go down, there's no harm spending actions for reactions. Often that will be the universal reaction counter, where you can get a little bit of damage back in. But if you're trying to save a fighter for a mission, maybe they're carrying treasure or holding an objective, then an ability like this that might help them survive can be good. The second action, Double Wind, only triggers if you manage to kill a target, so it's not always going to be available when you need it. That said, it is a nice heal, as it's for the ability dice, where often a similar ability will be half that. You do also have the option for the Universal Reprieve, but for that you can only do it outside of combat, which can be quite difficult, and it is triple. Typically, you'd like a more aggressive option with this, but it is nice to have, and anyone in the warband can use it. The last option open to everyone is the Royal Hunt. This is a quad, which I always say should never be relied on. You've got a decent chance to get a triple and upgrade it, but you're never able to guarantee getting it when you want it. Now, this is a straight upgrade on Rampage. You get the same bonus move and then an attack, but you get an extra dice if you're within 1 inch of a friendly fighter. Rampage is hands down the most common quad use, so an upgraded version is nice to see. There are only 3 non-hero fighters in this warband, so let's get straight into it. First up, we have the standard Man-at-Arms. Toughness only 3, and wounds at a relatively low 8, but all that for 55 points. The 2 average damage is actually great for that points cost. It's also an extremely fast fighter. Move 5 is way better than the average human. Presumably these loyal men are used to keeping up with the mounted knights. Moving up a level, we have the Squires. These are a little tougher and have a lot more wounds. At 185 points, they are more expensive than 3 Men-at-Arms. They do have more wounds overall, but slightly less damage. They're nice, but I suspect people will stick with the cheaper rank and file. The mounted squire, on the other hand, represents some additional options. Much faster and with the agile and fly keywords, presumably to reflect their impressive mounts. The agile ability opens up two abilities, a double skewering strike that will improve the strength by 1, which brings up to 5, which is a really good number to be at, and if you get a crit, it will pin the target in place. Net-like abilities are nice, and you're doing this also with a damage boost, so it's kind of a win-win. Now, it only works for the next melee action, and unfortunately you're looking at rolling a 6 on one of those 4 dice, so the chance of it actually happening is pretty much 50-50. The second ability, Intimidating Shout, is a triple that has a chance of doing damage to fighters within 8 inches. On a 5 you do 1 damage, and on a 6 you do damage equal to the ability. Typically these AoE-like abilities end up being underpowered. That's because they have to be balanced around the chance of getting lots of targets. If you do manage to get 6 targets, then you're still not going to do much damage, unfortunately. You'd expect 1 target to take 1 damage, and 1 target to take the dice value, so maybe a 3 or 4. It's probably better to look for a better use for triples, but nice to have, and it's always an option for the right moment. Overall, the mounted squire is a nice fighter, but probably a bit too expensive, especially when the damage is below the curve. At this kind of price range, I think you're probably better off moving over to one of the heroes instead. And speaking of which, these are the most important part of the Bretonnian list. While the fighters will provide the numbers, all the real work is going to get done by the heroes. Every hero has access to this triple, Bringer of Victory. This ability increases the move characteristics of nearby fighters by half the value, so that's up to 3 inches. This does also include the hero, so it does make for a nice boost. The trick with this ability is getting the double use out of it, so you want other fighters to start within 6 inches of the hero, then end their first move still within that big bubble. On a first turn, that might mean your hero has to limit their own movement, so the rest of the battle group are still within range. This warband is already pretty fast, so this extra boost should have them zooming across the map. The first of our heroes is the Archregent, a direct descendant of Leon Cure himself. Since we're just playing Warcry rather than Age of Sigmar, we only have the foot version rather than the classic Age of Sigmar version mounted on a griffin. The damage of 7.33 is pretty nice. It's not amazing by Warcry standards, but it's actually pretty great within this alliance overall. So this is probably one of the better heroes you're going to see. The Berserker runemark gives access to 2 abilities. Heroic Vitality, which is similar to the second wind ability, but doesn't require killing a target. And Stir of Righteous Fury, which will add 1 to the attacks of friendly fighters within 9 inches. As a quad, you are unlikely to use it. You're more likely to just use Royal Hunt with the Archregent to get that bonus move and attack. But there can be situations where spreading out the damage could work better. So again, it is a nice option to have. If you don't have the points, you can scale that down to the cheaper King. Perhaps not as fancy as the Archregent, but still a regent who rules over a kingdom in the mortal realms. This fighter has the same sets of abilities, but lower damage and wounds. It's a nice option to have. Having a king or an Archregent in your warband can be key, as we see with this knight on foot. They have the Chosen of the King ability. If they're within 6 inches of the king, they can use a double to increase their melee actions by 2 until the end of the turn. As they normally have 4 dice, that's a 50% damage increase. And if they don't need to move and can get 2 attacks out of it, then that's a double for an essentially a free attack, which is crazy good. There are 3 options in total for this Chosen of the King ability. After the Knight on foot, we have the Knight Courtier on foot. Slightly more wounds and slightly more damage. It's another nice option to have. You can also get this option with a mounted Knight Courtier. Even more points, but you get a big boost in maneuverability, both in actual movement of 10, but also with the fly keyword. This is the sort of problem solver that was sometimes referred to as a dragon. Tons of damage and quite capable of getting to any target you just need to delete. After that, we have 4 hero options. This Sergeant at Arms is basically an upgraded version of the Men at Arms, almost twice the price with double the damage but not double the wounds. Having a cheap hero, however, is a really nice option to have. It's not exciting, but it can open up types of warbands. The next step up is the Squire Courtier. It's another 30 points with damage up to 5.33 and wounds up to 16. This is actually the best damage per points you can find in the Warband, so don't discount it just because it's relatively plain. Next up we have the Questing Knight. This is a variation on the mounted Knight Courtier, but rather than having the Chosen of the King ability, it instead has abilities similar to that of the mounted Squire. So Skewering Strike and Intimidating Shout. Moving from 4 to 5 strength is pretty nice, and it'll have a decent increase of the damage. Again, the triple probably isn't worth it. You only have a 1 in 3 chance of actually doing damage on a target, but you may find situations where that will ramp up. Last up we have the Grail Knight. This continues the theme of the Mounted Knight, although with slightly less speed than the others. Using his lance, this fighter has a reach of 2, which is quite handy, but with 35 wounds you're probably not too worried about getting hit back. The key part of this fighter is the powerful strike ability, a triple that gives 3 extra dice to the next melee attack. So it's similar to the Chosen of the King, but instead of a double it's a triple, and you get 1 extra dice but just for the 1 attack. This essentially is 1 extra attack as a triple for this fighter, which is crazy good. Now, I did go slightly out of order here. The Grail Knight is actually the second most expensive behind the Mounted Knight Courtier, who's 20 points more and does 0.3 more damage on average. Deciding between either might depend on whether you want to have a king in your warband or not, but we'll talk about that a little bit later. There is one Bretonnian Bladeborn warband, and that is a Grimwatch, led by the heroic Duke Crackmorrow. The Duke is an interesting variant on the King. He loses that key Berserker runemark, which is needed for the other fighters to use Chosen of the King. But he does instead get Royal Decree, an ability that lets him give a bonus attack to a member of the Grimwatch. I suspect the Chosen of the King is going to be better in the long run, but it is a nice option to have. Comparing stats, you pay 25 points less and only lose 1 toughness. You also gain reach with that great axe the Duke favours. The rest of his hunting party are largely variations on the men-at-arms. Remember, any of these can be taken as unique fighters. They are considered part of the Bretonnian warband as a whole, but you can only take 1 of each. All are 5 move, and most have 10 wounds, which is 2 more than the normal man-at-arms. The man-at-arms is 55 points, doing 2 damage on average. Unfortunately, none of these are doing big damage, so the Duke himself giving an extra attack isn't going to get great value out of it. They do make for interesting options if you have points to spare. I'd probably avoid a tracker, but the Herald is at least 2 more wounds for just 10 points. The most interesting are probably the Harriers, who are much faster and have fly. To skip us along to the Thrall options, the Harriers at 75 are a good deal cheaper than these larger hunting birds at 130. With so many mounted options though, we probably don't need the cheaper flyers, but they can be handy for certain missions. The hunting dog is also an interesting option compared to man-at-arms. A good chunk more expensive, but a little bit faster and with a very nice reaction that can be useful if you have a leader to protect. I also briefly want to mention the monster option, where the Bretonnia list has access to these 2 amazing dragons. These are the adjusted costs. They had a FAQ increase recently, and they're crazy expensive, almost certainly costed out of competitive play. Probably. You can still take the cheaper dragon at 500, a cheap leader like the Sergeant at Arms, and fill out the list with 7 men at arms. So you'd have a decent number of bodies, but the only real threat would be the dragon, so they'd need to get a lot of work done. It could be a fun list, and it's not that often you get a run a dragon. More importantly, you do get the dragon as a model in the old Start Collecting Bretonnia box set, so it might be something you already have in your collection. As I did during the Skaven video, I want to avoid giving actual lists. Mostly that's because I don't really have the experience with these warbands to do justice, but also because the metagame is still relatively young, and there may be top lists we've yet to see. Instead, I'm going to talk about the main components, and for this warband, which is relatively small, the primary components are going to be a king of some sort, and an elite hero who can use a Chosen of the King ability. You can play around with these options, so you have got 2 king options and 3 elite options to select from. This will give you something incredibly powerful to spend your doubles on, and obviously these should be kept together. The other component would be the Grail Knight, who can use that triple to great effect. These 2 options combined give you 2 pretty scary battle groups. Both combined will cost between 675 and 795 points, so you're going to be going straight to the men-at-arms to round the numbers. Even at a worst case situation, that would be another 3 bodies, so your warband is going to be sitting at 6 fighters in total. That would be a Grail Knight, an Archregent, a Mounted Knight Courtier, any of which would be terrifying to deal with. As a faction overall, Bretonnia has a pretty straightforward setup. They have some fantastic elites and a really great chaff fighter to round out the numbers when you need to. That said, there's nothing wrong with simple. Often the challenge is going to be where to strike that balance. I suspect you're always going to have that triple hero combo of King, Knight and Grail Knight to maximize the doubles and triples. It'll depend on what scenario you're expecting to face, on how many points you're going to sink into them, and how many of those cheap men-at-arms you're going to want doing the hard work on the ground. Well, I hope you enjoy this. Thank you very much for listening. And if you've got any thoughts or tips on how you would field a Bretonnian warband, please do post them in the comments. Thanks for making it all the way to the end. Hopefully you enjoyed this video. Each week I put up a new video talking about one of Games Workshop's specialist games. The goal is always to try and make the best possible 2-player experience. If this is something you'd find interesting, please subscribe to the channel and comment to let me know what you'd like to see in future.